Hi, this is Poly D from Behringer. Clearly based on their and Moog's Model D, but expanded in quite a few ways. It's analog, it has 4 oscillators instead of 3. They can be played paraphonically or polyphonically, depending on your definition of those terms. It has a sequencer and arpeggiator and velocity-sensitive keyboard with aftertouch, and analog distortion and chorus circuits. Now I'll start with a question I had in mind, and I'm sure you do too. What does polyphony mean within the context of this synth? In most synths marketed today, polyphonic means more than one voice, each voice playable separately with a keyboard or sequencer, with a voice being a set of one or more oscillators, a dedicated VCA with its own envelope. Typically in a subtractive synth, that means a dedicated filter with its own articulation per voice as well. There are, however, a few exceptions where in some synths, some voices or oscillators may share a filter or a VCA. Another distinction you might make between a polyphonic and paraphonic or monosynth is whether the oscillators can be played separately with a keyboard or sequencer rather than just tuned separately using coarse or fine tuning. So back to Poly D, it has 4 oscillators with a single filter and a single filter envelope, as well as a overall VCA envelope, one VCA envelope for all 4. However, there are a few internal little tricks that let you gate them separately as you play separate notes, as well as tune them to separate notes as you play them on the keyboard. You control these modes using the polyphony mode or poly mode switch here. There are 3 of them: mono, uni or unison, and poly. In mono mode, Poly D behaves just like a regular monosynth. So this is one oscillator. I can add another one. Right, for 2 oscillators, tune this separately, add another one, a third, and there's a 4th one. So you can make really big chords with 4 oscillators all moving together alongside the one note that you play on the keyboard. Where things get interesting are the unison and poly modes. Unison mode is simpler. It behaves like mono mode when you press a single note. All 4 oscillators will play at once. But if you play 2 notes, it'll take 2 oscillators and play the first note, and then another 2 oscillators and play the second note. Now this is best heard when the oscillators are tuned to each other. So let's do that. By the way, a little trick to tuning the oscillators quickly without a tuner is just turn on one, then compare it to the second, and move this until it sounds as thin as possible. And do the next one. And the next one. So now they're tuned to more or less the same frequency, which is very boring if you've got a 4 oscillator synth. But the point is that now if I play 2 notes, this note gets 2 oscillators, this note gets 2 oscillators. And if I add another one, the 4th oscillator gets turned off, and each note in the chord gets a single oscillator. Same goes, of course, for 4. So that's unison mode, and then poly mode is very similar. It just won't attempt to allocate more than one oscillator to a single note. So if I press one note, it'll just get one oscillator, add another note, it'll get another oscillator, and so on. So those are the basic unison and poly modes, and the cool thing about this is that you can play relatively closed chords on the keyboard, but easily spread them out across a broader range. You won't know exactly which oscillator will get which note, and that can be either a desirable effect or not, depending on your point of view. So up until now, this sounds just like any other polyphonic synth. Where things start to diverge is when you start adding a filter envelope or a VCA envelope to the articulation of your sound. So let's say, for example, I add a slow attack and slow decay or release in this case. It's all good as long as I play one note, but as I start adding notes, they'll start immediately. They won't have a slow attack because there's only one VCA envelope to go around. Now there are two options for how notes behave after the first note you press in a chord, and those are determined by the auto damp function. So when auto damp is on, any note added after the first note will have a quick attack and a quick decay, so basically an on-off switch, a gate, as you play it. And then if you play a different note and leave the first one, it'll stop abruptly because it only has a gate controlling it. When you leave the last note, it'll slowly decay based on the decay in the loudness contour or VCA envelope. The challenge you might find with this is if you play a chord and leave the notes at once, see that some of them may end abruptly. This problem can be solved by turning auto damping off, in which case notes are always held. The problem with this mode is that as you play notes, they're always held, even if you leave the note, which as you move notes across may or may not be an effect you want. So you need to experiment with this. I think auto damp on is best suited for playing fast leads or basses with maybe an occasional chord, but you do risk sort of these abrupt stops in chords, and then auto damp off is best for playing chords. If you play fast leads, just make sure not to play legato, because notes might stick. So as long as you make sure not to play legato, this works really well for chords and for single notes. For pads and so on. So that's polyphony or paraphony within the context of Poly D. There are a few additional nice advantages to having 4 oscillators dealt with in this way. We'll get to that when we talk about the arpeggiator. Meanwhile, let's just start with an overview, which we missed in the beginning of this video. The overall hardware build feels very solid. The panel can be tilted in 3 different angles in addition to flat. The knobs and switches feel very solid and they're very well spaced out. The pitch and mod wheels are plastic, but they're very comfortable and easy to use. They light up when you use them, which is always a good reminder that you have modulation going on. The keybed is velocity sensitive with aftertouch. It has 3 octaves with full-size keys. The action is light, but doesn't feel low quality. You can only transpose the keyboard 1 octave down or up using this switch, which is a bit limiting if you want to use this as a MIDI controller, but there's a good additional octave range, obviously using the oscillator range switches, so you can play as low or as high as you need. As a synth, I mentioned this before, it's a 4 oscillator synth with 6 fixed waveforms per oscillator. It has 1 additional LFO with a simple mod matrix with 5 sources and 2 destinations, oscillator pitch and filter cutoff. The 4th oscillator can be disconnected from keyboard or sequencer control and be used either as a drone note or in low frequencies as a more complex LFO compared to the simpler one here. The filter is a 24 dB per octave low pass and high pass filter. There's a filter envelope, a VCA envelope, and an additional bonus distortion, chorus, and arpeggiator and sequencer modules. You've got volume control for the balanced line outputs, as well as volume control for the headphone output. And also on the back are a series of modular inputs and outputs, clock in and out, keyboard outputs, including trimmable velocity and aftertouch control voltage outputs, as well as an external audio input for processing by the filter, distortion, and chorus circuits. And you've got control voltage inputs for the filter, VCA, oscillator pitch, and mod matrix source. I'll show you patch IDs with this later on. To complete the connectivity picture, Poly D also has 5-pin MIDI in, out, and through, as well as USB for MIDI I/O and configuration using Sysx or Behringer's Synthtool. The chorus is quite lovely and adds a lot. It has 2 modes, 1, right, or 2, as well as a combination between the 2. And on for 2. Stereo chorus, of course. 1, So this certainly adds a lot. The distortion circuit is also very nice. It doesn't have a dry-wet control, so sort of there's always a little bit of impact. But yeah, the distortion has controllable tone, a tilt between high and low pass, and it's very nice. So super nice additions to the tonal palette of the Poly D, both the distortion and chorus. I'll get to the sequencer and arpeggiator section later on. Let's start with the oscillators and take a listen to the filter as well. So you've got overall tuning. This applies to all 4 oscillators. They move together with this fine-tune control. They took out the A440 switch out of here, so you'll need to use an external tuner if you want to tune this to play with someone else. And then each oscillator has a broad range of octave transpose options all the way to low. Like I mentioned, you have transpose control here for the keyboard as well. There are 6 waveforms: triangle, shark tooth, ramp or saw on the scope, then there's a square wave with a few pulse width options. Don't have any pulse width modulation here, but there are plenty of oscillators to go around and get a similar effect. Oscillator 1 doesn't have fine-tune control, but oscillators 2 through 4 do. And then oscillator 4 is a bit different from the others. It has a ramp and saw instead of just a saw and shark tooth, and the reason is not because the ramp or saw sound different, but rather for when you want to use it as a mod source, so you can disconnect oscillator 4 from control by the keyboard and then pass it through the mod matrix. We'll talk about this later. Another use for disconnecting oscillator 4 from the keyboard is just to use it as a fixed drone. So when it's connected to the keyboard, everything sounds good. When you disconnect it, you'll need to tune it to whatever note you want, and then you can use it as a fixed drone note as well. So that's pretty much it for the oscillator section. Onto the mixer section, you've seen me click these buttons quite a lot. You've got on-off control for each of the 4 oscillators, as well as level control for each in the mixer. And then the 2 other options are noise, either white noise or pink noise. And then external input control, so you can plug in audio through the input in the back and control its level. Now, if you don't have anything plugged in the external input, Behringer's original Model D had the audio routed back in for a feedback effect. It isn't like that in this. Maybe this is just because this is a prototype, but regardless, you can still enjoy the feedback trick by plugging audio into the headphone out and back into the external signal input. And you need to be careful with levels here, but you can add feedback, whether subtle or distorted, and there's a helpful overload LED to let you know when you're taking things too far or doing it right, depending on your point of view. So that's pretty much the mixer. Let's move on to the filter. The Poly D's filter is a classic 24 dB per octave slope low-pass filter, which cuts out the frequencies above the cutoff frequency. It has a high pass mode, which works to lower the level of the lower frequencies. And it also, of course, has emphasis or resonance which is an amplification of the frequencies at the cutoff point. And the resonance will self-oscillate above a certain level. It actually goes quite high here relative to the original signal. Now, since this is a pre-production model, there was no point in comparing this neither to the MiniMoog or to Behringer's original Model D. But I'm told the production units will have the exact same filter as Behringer's Model D, and there are plenty of online comparisons where it fares quite well. So that's the filter. Let's talk about envelopes. Poly D has two envelopes. They're both either 3-stage or 4-stage envelopes, depending on where you have the decay button. With decay off, the envelopes will be 3-stage envelopes. Attack is always the time to reach maximum level or modulation depth. Decay is the time it takes to reach from the maximum modulation depth or loudness to the sustain level. And then if you have decay on, a similar decay time is basically the release time of the envelope from the sustain level down to 0. It's always slightly more intuitive to understand this with loudness. So attack is the time it takes to reach maximum level. Sustain is the sustain level after the attack and decay stages. So it'll go up to the highest level, then down to the sustain level. Decay is the time it takes it to reach the sustain level. And then if you have decay on, you'll get a release stage. And if you have it off, you'll still get attack, decay, and sustain, but 0 release time. The same applies to the filter envelope controlling the filter cutoff frequency. Now, mod depth is only positive, meaning you need to have a low cutoff frequency for filter modulation to be heard. So let's say I'll add another oscillator, set the filter cutoff here, maybe add some resonance, and we want the envelope to make this motion. So let's lower all this so we can hear just filter move. So I'll set the mod depth to set a target for the attack decay and set an attack time. So attack time is the time it'll take the filter cutoff to reach the maximum cutoff frequency as determined by the mod depth. Decay is the time it'll take it to go back down. Let's make this shorter. And sustain is an intermediate level that the filter cutoff will go to as long as the key is held. So attack, decay down to sustain level, and then if I have release on, and I'll turn this up so we can hear it, the filter will go down as I leave the key. We'll talk about filter modulation in a bit. The last bit of control you have is keyboard control over the filter cutoff. So if you turn both of these off, the filter won't move as you play up and down the keyboard, which will cause higher notes to be silenced if the filter cutoff is too low. So typically you want some sort of motion of the filter cutoff alongside what you play on the keyboard, and you can have it either a third of the motion of the keyboard, 2/3 when this switch is on, or if both switches are on, then full keyboard tracking for the filter. It tracks quite nicely. Okay, so we talked about two modulation sources and destinations, the VCA envelope for level and the filter envelope for the cutoff frequency. We have two additional options to modulate either the oscillator pitch or the filter cutoff as modulation destinations using one of 5 sources. Either oscillator 4 as a mod source, the filter envelope as a mod source, the LFO, either a triangle or square wave LFO right here, and then the noise source, and alternatively, if you have a control voltage source plugged into the mod source input in the back, you can use that as a mod source as well. The way this mod matrix works is you select either one of the 2 sources here, so either oscillator 4 or filter envelope, and either the noise or mod source or the LFO. then choose the mix between whatever you chose here over here, and then that gets sent through the mod wheel either to the oscillator or the filter cutoff if these switches are on. So let's take a look, for example, at the built-in LFO over here. I'll take a triangle wave, choose the LFO here and not the noise source, put the mod mix all the way to the LFO, then say choose oscillator pitch as a modulation destination. And then like I mentioned, because the mod wheel is a controller for this modulation, we won't hear anything unless we bring this up. So this is full mod depth, no mod depth, and I can control the LFO rate or shape. And I could take another source, say for example noise, again mod depth. Let's apply this to the filter, LFO to the filter, triangle LFO to the filter, and let's say choose the oscillator 4 is good, and increase its mix. Nice control over modulation mix. And oscillator 4 is really a much better LFO than this LFO, no offense, because it has more shapes. And so a ramp will make this rhythmic result, and a saw. I'm gonna go down. And there are the regular options. You don't need an oscillator 4 for that, unless you want to go into really high FM rates, right? Because oscillator 4 goes much higher than the LFO. So that's the simple mod matrix with its 5 sources and 2 destinations. Just to complete this section, you also have glide control, if it's on, which lets you gradually transition between notes. And with that said, let's move on to the arpeggiator and sequencer section. The arpeggiator works as you'd expect it to. Turn it on. It will arpeggiate between the notes you play, right? As you hold a pattern. There's a hold function for it. And you can change the gate length by holding shift and turning this knob. There's an indication here. And you have a few arpeggiator patterns that you can pick by holding shift and pressing these buttons. And a really cool thing about the arpeggiator is that if you move into poly mode when it's running, it'll cycle through the oscillators. Let's turn them on. And then, so it'll be pretty normal. Just get the gate up a bit. If they're all the same, it'll sort of behave as you'd expect an arpeggiator to behave. But if you start playing around with them, then it could get pretty interesting. Maybe I'll pick a 3-note pattern. Isn't that cool? That it sort of cycles between the oscillators. Yeah, this round robin functionality of the arpeggiator is pretty neat. So that's the arpeggiator. Poly D also has a polyphonic sequencer built in with up to 32 steps per pattern, and you can store 64 patterns in 8 banks of 8 patterns. Fairly easy to use and also identical to Behringer's other sequencers, so if you're familiar with them, you'll feel right at home here. There are maybe a few cryptic key presses, but once you get over those, this is pretty straightforward. For example, Shift, Reset, and Pattern erases a pattern, but to record a pattern, you just hit record and play it in. You can always edit the notes step by step. So go to any note that I like, and let's say change this one to this one. Go across the pages by hitting the page button. You've got 4 pages of 8 notes. Let's start a new pattern. When you record a pattern or when you edit it later on, you can change the note length or move this up to 8 to get a tie. You can add a glide by turning the glide knob to the right, and then this LED will light up. Shift and glide will add ratchets, up to 4 ratchets. Let's add a few more. Let's say this. You can also add an accent by pressing the accent button, in which case this LED will light up. Let's add an accent here as well. So if I hit play, this is my pattern. I need to turn on glide to hear it. Maybe a bit of emphasis. You can also add swing by holding Shift and turning the tempo knob. So not exactly a great 303 pattern, but it's getting there. And then a couple of other noteworthy playback functions. You can transpose a pattern as it's playing. And if you want, you can also mute steps in Shift Step mode. And then to save a masterpiece, you just hit Shift and play stop for 2 seconds. You choose the pattern you want to save this to or the bank you want to save it to. And then to save, you press Shift Rec. The Poly D is a USB class compliant MIDI device, meaning you don't need special software to use it and send MIDI back and forth, but Behringer's Synthtool lets you change a few settings like MIDI channels, turning multi-trig on or off, and a few other options. So before we get to the pros and cons, a few tips and tricks for using Poly D. A lot of detuned oscillators is great for a single monophonic fat sound, but for polyphonic chords, it doesn't sound right. So you'll want to get used to tuning your oscillators quickly. You can use a tuner, but like I showed you before, it's not that hard to tune the oscillators. I'd recommend putting them in sawtooth mode. I think that when you have more harmonics, it's easier to tune them to each other. Then put it in mono mode. Just go one by one and look for the spot where it sounds the least fat. That's probably where they're tuned to each other. Right, so thin is your friend when you're tuning the oscillators. 2 other tips I mentioned before. Oscillator 4 is a great mod source in saw or ramp modes. And I'd just recommend having a cable plugged in from the headphone out to the external in so you can bring in distortion and crazy badness using the external volume in, unless you're using it to process external audio, of course. For quick vibrato, put the LFO in triangle mode, map it to the oscillators. You can play multiple notes at once, so you certainly want to enjoy rise style sounds. To get that effect, just set contour to taste with slow attack and decay settings and 0 sustain, or to taste as well, emphasis as well to taste, and you have a quick rise. And in terms of patch ideas, you at the very least want to use aftertouch and velocity response here. So a typical nice patch, for example, would be to connect aftertouch to the filter cutoff. So that's how you can control timbre with aftertouch. And if this is too extreme, you can always moderate it with the trimmer. And then another useful patch is patching velocity out to loudness, which makes use of the velocity sensitivity of the keyboard. and you can trim that as well. Next up, the distortion circuit really rings nicely with resonance coming out of the filter. It can get to extremes sometimes, but certainly changes and enhances the tonal quality of this synth. Here's another example of the almost formant-like sounds you can get using resonance, modulation, and the distortion. And then a final neat little trick with Oscillator 4 modulating filter pitch. Okay, so let's take a look at the pros and cons. On the cons side, when I first heard the name Poly D, I have to admit I was expecting a fully polyphonic synth, so 4 copies of everything you see here with independent filter and VCA envelope articulation per voice, 3 or 4 oscillators per voice, and an LFO per voice, why not? And it probably would have cost a lot more. So even though Poly D has an independent gate per note in poly mode, I would still put it in the paraphonic category rather than the polyphonic category, just because of how other manufacturers like Moog and Arturia have been using the term in recent years. But like I showed you before, with some limitations, you can definitely get polyphonic results with this. Further, on the cons side, like many but not all analog synths, you can't save presets here, other than patterns on the sequencer. So if you created a magnificent patch, I recommend shooting a short video with the patch audio in the background, walking yourself through the essential settings for recall later on. Other cons compared to other analog monosynths available today are a lack of hard sync and a relatively small number of modulation destinations, only 2 on the mod matrix. But then again, the goal here obviously wasn't to make a monosynth with the most features, but rather to pay homage to the classic vintage MiniMoog with some interesting twists. I also wish the distortion and chorus effects had a dry wet mix control, in particular the distortion, because it's really nice, but you can't quite totally take it out of the picture when it's on. Other things that may be fixed in a future firmware update, but don't hold me to it, I have no inside information about this. It would be nice if the sequencer had more than 32 steps, 64 would be nice. It would also be nice to control some of the features that you have access to using the Synthtool control software, using the onboard panel with some sort of shift combo, if only the basic stuff like turning multi-trig on or off, or maybe changing MIDI channels. Another thing that hopefully may be fixed or changed in a firmware upgrade, it would be nice if when you took Oscillator 4 out of the pool of oscillators that move along with the keyboard, that it would be also taken out of the polyphony pool. When it's in low mode and included, say, in a round robin cycle or as part of a chord, it's just silent. And if you're using it as a modulator in high mode, it'll probably play a note that you didn't plan in your chord. Now you can certainly turn it off so whatever it's doing won't be audible in your chords, but it would be nice if in round robin mode and polyphonic mode, you could take Oscillator 4 out of the note stealing and round road options when it's in modulation mode. On the pros side, you can't deny what this looks and sounds like. There have been multiple side-by-side comparisons of Behringer's smaller Model D and the original MiniMoog, and they're close enough so that if you're a MiniMoog fan, Behringer's Model D is a no-brainer buy. Now, I reviewed Behringer's Model D in the past, and my main issue is that it was a bit too cramped, so Poly D certainly solves that problem. And with a keyboard, additional oscillator, arpeggiator, sequencer, great sounding chorus and distortion, there's a lot of charm in this. Now it does cost more than Behringer's Model D, so depending on what this sells for, if you look at it as a polyphonic synth, there might be better options for you like Behringer's own DeepMind or say the MiniMoog XD. But if you're looking for an analog synth with a classic look and feel and knob per function interface with a few useful upgrades that have dramatic impact on the sound and what you can do with it, with a few nice quirks in the paraphonic or polyphonic modes depending on how you define them, the Poly D will probably give you what you're looking for. And if you're looking for ideas on what to do with a synth like this or any other synth, check out my book available for people who support this channel on Patreon. Hit like if this was useful, ring the bell after hitting subscribe if you want to make sure you don't miss the next one. Feel free to ask me anything in the comment section below. Thanks for watching.